Thanks for joining us for the last session about how to partner with IT. So we'll try and keep it interesting. We were planning for 20, 25 minutes of questions and then leave 15 minutes or so for you all to ask these guys some questions. So before we begin, my name is Madison. I work at Morningstar, but maybe Lee and Jeff, if you could introduce yourselves, your background, sort of what side of the coin you're on.
Yeah, so hi everybody. My name is Lee Davidson. I lead Morningstar's quant research team, which is effectively a data science team, but because we're in the financial services space, we call ourselves quants, so we're the original data scientists. So I've been at Morningstar 9 years. I've been in quant for 6, and I've been managing the department for 4 years. And Madison works with me on the team, so any question I can't answer, she'll be here to keep me honest.
Hi, I'm Jeff Hirsch. I've been at Morningstar for 6 years, and right now I'm focusing on the analytic product space, which is the models that Lee builds, how we get those into our products and into production and operationalized. Before that, I was at Merrill Lynch for about a decade, and then a brief stint in professional consulting at a company called BA Systems, and some time at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So got about 18 years in the financial industry.
Awesome, thanks. So this panel is called How to Partner with IT. And so implicit in that panel title is the idea that you've already decided to partner with IT. But I think we want to take a step back and talk about what are some of the prerequisites that are required, some of the questions that you should ask yourselves before you decide to partner with IT.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's maybe forgotten a little bit, and at least I had to relearn when I moved from being like a quant researcher, data scientist to being a group head or manager, is how to explain the value that we provide and why we're doing what we do. So I think there's kind of 2 prerequisites to start, I think, any data scientist project that people should be kind of fluent in and everyone should be an ambassador for. So there has to be a lot of valuable questions to ask, right? And I think we a lot of times assume that there are, the companies that we're at, and sometimes, and the speaker before I think hit on a good thing, sometimes people just need BI reporting, right? And I think being able to do kind of a pros and cons or cost-benefit analysis upfront for using data science as a discipline at your company is a very valuable skill and something, everyone, including, the most junior data scientists should be able to do. And then I think the second one is that you actually have data to answer that question. That seems obvious, but you'd be surprised, and maybe some of you have experienced this yourselves in applications, but surprised how often product owners, business owners, salespeople, et cetera, that you meet with, they want to contract with you to work on a project, think they have the data, but they don't. That's happened to a number of instances with us. Databases were designed to store information, but not necessarily with analytics in mind. So I think those 2 things are just good reminders to become fluent in and reminding your business stakeholders what it is that you do and the value that you bring and how you can be successful.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is, having the data is one thing, obviously, and then also how easily accessible is it? And I think you kind of, touched briefly on it, but if you've got data spread in a lot of different databases and you're trying to join those disparate data sets, you could spend a lot of your time just trying to get all that data in a central place so you can make sense of it. So, one of the things that we're focusing on as part of our analytics is building out a data lake. And that's, I think that's critical to actually supporting kind of the analytics is how can you get this superset of data all in one place. And it can be counterintuitive, actually, because a lot of times maybe you're taking data sets from databases and they're highly structured data sets, and you're moving them to like a semi-structured data set in the lake. And someone's like, or people would be like, why are you doing that? Why are you losing fidelity? But the reason is that you're getting it all into one central location, and you're allowing the queryability of it so that you can do this type of stuff.
Okay, so suppose that you have the data, you have a question to answer, and the data is roughly in the way that you need it. So how do you think about working together, IT and quant or data science? Because typically quant or data science is very open-ended. There's a lot of research questions. There's a lot of unknowns. Whereas on the IT side, you work in either agile or waterfall, where you have tasks, very strict, timelines, deadlines, deliverables. And so those are two very, opposing workflows. So how do you guys work together?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that, in the spirit of an agile mindset, I think continuous integration, like just that principle, is key. And so from like a working relationship, what that means to me is what are our touch points, and how can we integrate early and often, essentially. So how can we get in front of this and be truly integrated with the team? And so I think setting standards on or agreeing on like conventions for how models are built, and agreeing on, it goes kind of going back to the data, like conventions on where the data is going to reside, and just getting aligned with that will pay dividends, like when the time comes to actually do the handoff, if you kind of have that upfront understanding of where that kind of handshake happens.
The other thing we've started to do is to get more clear about the stages that our projects are in, to develop like an internal vernacular. So we have 5 different categories of projects: exploration, active research, model development, go to market, productionize, and then launched and maintain. And so we try to categorize every project into one of those 5 buckets, because the way we manage those projects and operate on them with agile or what have you changes depending on the stage that they're in. So, and the gentleman speaking before mentioned this as well, having to adopt agile to suit data science. We've had to do that as well for the first 2 buckets, especially where we're doing exploratory research, where we just get access to a new data set that plopped on the data lake. We have no idea what we want to do with it or how it would connect to something else. We want to actively explore that. Or research, where we have maybe 3 or 4 different ideas for how to tackle a problem, but no defined solution. And in both those cases, we have kind of adopted agile. We've used a lot of the same ceremonies for communication to stay on the same page, but we're not doing like story point estimation or velocity commitments or anything like that. We kind of manage it more like an MBA contract, where like there's a team option to pick up 2, 3, 4 more years in the MBA context, or pick up 1, 2, 3, 4 more months of active exploration and research. So we say it's kind of like a spike, maybe, if in agile parlance. So, hey, you can research this for a month, 2 months, and that'll be the time commitment. And if we want to opt into more, if it looks promising, we do that. Once we settle on a solution that we want to develop, that's where we start moving much more in an agile fashion at that break point in basically bucket 3. And then a lot of the software engineering principles, best practices, we work with Jeff and team on.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, we have a kind of a checklist as well that we developed for when this handoff is happening. Things like does QA tests exist for the model? We're starting to collaborate, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on leveraging Jupyter notebooks together and kind of sharing those notebooks. So there is kind of like a checklist that we try and put in place to kind of help with that handoff when things go to be productionized.
So both of you kind of just touched upon sort of the maturity of a research project, from exploratory to research, model development, sort of down to implementation. So one of my least favorite things is when I'm a researcher and I'm tasked with sort of supporting QA of this model when questions come in. So how do you guys, how have you solved for that? So someone who's more of a researcher is trying to do, innovation, blue sky thinking versus, having to be able to hop on the phone with a client or, dig through the data to answer a question.
Well, if anybody that's been doing data science for the last 4 or 5 years, especially, or maybe longer, or they've been doing it for that long, knows if it had a successful project, there's a decent likelihood that your model might have like gotten out of the lab, and now you're on the hook for maintaining some like R script that you weren't planning on having to support. But some salesman got a hold of it, they made a great sale, and now you're like, oh crap, I gotta keep this up to date. That happened when we were still kind of growing. So when we started managing the team 5 or 4 years ago, it was about a 4-person group, and now we're like in the 60s or 70s or something like that. And so we had a few of those instances where a few of our things got out of the lab and we didn't plan for that. We didn't know what we were doing. flying by the seat of our pants. And that created a lot of burden and pressure on the researcher to maintain what they produced. And as the manager, of course, I'm getting pressure from the sales team, like, you got to make sure that thing doesn't break and so forth. So I think on those instances, we had to commit like time to re-platform, move them over to a more stable, robust environment where, you know, there's unit tests and all that sort of good stuff. But you know, I think on new projects, committing up front that there's going to be a handoff point and how that handoff point looks, whether that's to a different person, a different team, what's involved, like setting those kind of clear expectations on what the researcher is required to do. Are they required to build production level code with unit tests and regression tests and system tests, et cetera? Or is it just a prototype that someone else is going to implement? So I think that's something that we've been trying to get a little more clarity on is how that handoff works.
Yeah.
So you also just brought up this concept about getting out of the lab. In both your experience, what is the most difficult part of getting a project out of the lab, and maybe how has that changed in, you know, 5, 10, 15 years?
I mean, I would say that just from my experience, you know, it started with grabbing these SQL statements and getting dumps of data into like an S3 bucket. And you guys were leveraging that, and the models running in like a dev-based account in AWS, like a quant-based account. So I really think that to the degree that you can, I mean, it's the point that Lee just said, like knowing that, like figuring out what that handoff is. So now that handoff, we kind of know what it is up front, but before we were retroactively figuring out how to do the handoff. When the quants were initially maintaining kind of the support of that. And, you know, to the degree that you can push things, I guess, up the resource stack. So if you look at kind of how support works, right, from an IT organization, you normally have like a tier 1 technical operations center, tier 2, you know, some sort of DevOps with a little bit of more app specific expertise. And then tier 3 kind of goes to the developers or maybe the quants of the model in this case. The more that we can push up to the tier 1 and tier 2, I think is the approach that we've been taking. And so, you know, one of the things we've been doing is establishing this relationship with QA, as an example, with the notebooks that are being created and our QA understanding the results of the notebooks, and leveraging kind of the same tools and the same technology. I think the overall spirit of it is that the IT organization needs to move closer towards the quant organization and start learning some of the skills that they're doing. And similarly, the quant organization needs to move closer to kind of development or engineering and learn some of the skills that engineers have kind of been you know, trained with. So both are kind of at each end of the spectrum, and they both are kind of moving more towards the middle to meet up.
Yeah, the reality is it's kind of a gray area, right? Like where you draw that handoff line, especially when it comes to QA. And I think you mentioned like what's gotten difficult. I think like 5 or 6 years ago, the most difficult part was discovering the right algorithm or the right solution to a problem, or maybe even finding the problem in the first place that someone was willing to spend money to have your time be spent on. But now, at least for us, like our pain point, I feel like is much more around, okay, now that we're not rolling out 1 or 2, or last year I think we rolled out 5 or 6 new models, but now we've got dozens. I think this year on pace for more than 50 models to roll off of like our assembly line, our platform into production. How do we maintain those, monitor those at scale? And I think the QA practices we need to do when we're doing full model retrainings on like an automated basis, the types of QA or like health checks that you're running are not just, is the server stood up, is it available, you know, is memory being constrained or not? It's okay, actually, or do we have any drift, or what's the accuracy of these models, or are we meeting our business requirements, or what's the coverage look like, or do we have what's our change in missing values? All these types of things that you'd normally check during like a data cleaning or a validation process and a one-off, trying to do that on an automated basis, and then saving those results for queryability later. Those are some of the things that we've started to get really serious about and spend a lot of time doing, and probably even more time from an overall resource perspective than just the actual research on which model to use. It's also become really important in compliance use cases. So for a lot of our clients, the models that we deliver to them or the insights we deliver to them, they want to validate them independently. And so we often need to provide those model statistics in conjunction with the actual insights and analytics as well. So I think having a good QA plan up front that's specific to your use case is critical. And definitely, I think now more difficult than maybe some of the other aspects of research.
Something that you just brought up, we did not plan for this, but you talk a little bit about how some of our clients require, validation. So we've built out what we call audit trails, which essentially track every part of a calculation, so you can go back in and then validate, is that doing what you're supposed to be doing? And so over, a massive code base, that can be quite expensive to produce an audit trail. So when you're thinking about whether or not you build that in, you turn it on, you run it every day or monthly, how do you think about that problem of the benefit of it versus the cost of it?
Well, I'll kick this over actually to Jeff to comment on first. You're a big believer in data lineage, especially for analytics use cases.
Yeah.
You talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we want to know like what files or what files in the lake were leveraged by which models, and so I think having an audit trail of that snapshot, our data lake, we have certain principles that we adhere to. Immutability in a particular section of the lake is one of them, where once something hits, it never gets changed. And we just keep adding new files or deltas or whatever. And so I think tracking that is a huge thing. But I also, I don't want to speak for Lee's team on the cost of it, but I mean the audit trail in my mind is, it's essential to the debugging to begin with, right? Like you're coding, you're taking steps through a program and making sure that it's working the way that it should be working. And so knowing, writing that information out to disk and persisting that, is something that can add value as you're doing it, and then as a side effect, it just becomes, part of it. Is that?
Yeah, I think, and then the other aspect too is the transformations, like tracking all the transformations to the data that we'll do for different models. There'll obviously be some code that's executing the logic, but storing at intermediate steps the output for easy debugging, especially when you have it, like for us, we have an operational model where the researchers, we're trying not to have them maintain the models that they build. And so that means people who didn't build them, even if they're statisticians, are maintaining something they didn't build and aren't intimately familiar with. And so trying to build in processes for them to be able to QA, okay, something's going wrong, we're having model drift, the input features, the distributions are changing, we're having more missing values. Okay, where in the kind of the causal chain or transformation chain is it breaking down? And so we've been in some of our applications where we kind of feel like the investment is warranted, we've been writing that, databasing the output at different transformation steps. In other ones, we've been, I think, maybe less willing to make that call. But I think it's an important principle to keep in mind, and something that certainly having storage constraints kind of blown away by moving to cloud, we've been able to do that.
Yeah. So that was a little bit about QA of model development. Also on the sort of model testing, model ongoing management, how do you think about data ownership? So you talked a little bit about how some people are going to be responsible for debugging it, but they weren't the people who developed the model. How do you generalize that for all data on the lake? Like, how do you think about who is the SME, who owns the data, or when do you kick it back down to collections?
Yeah, we the producer of the data is typically the owner. They're responsible for the SLAs of when they're going to deliver it. They're responsible for getting it in a certain format. We build, like, our lake is the goal is it's a self-service platform, right? So we're providing the infrastructure and the APIs for them to as frictionless as possible to move data into it. But if there's problems, then it's ultimately up to the the producer of that data set to fix that problem. We will fire alerts if there's errors. That's part of the strategy. And one of the things we're talking about for 2020 is creating some sort of like BDD, behavioral driven validation or quality checks on the data that anyone can add to, and maybe it goes through an approval process of who the producer is, but it's just this kind of crowdsourcing idea of the quality of the data, very similar to like Wikipedia has their readers are their editors, and so our philosophy is the consumers of the data probably more than likely may have some insight into whether it's quality or not, and they can probably be responsible, or they could potentially write validation checks on what the data should look like, and we want to enable them through the platform to do that.
Yeah, maybe just some more background. So I think this is probably a common problem, especially at data companies or bigger companies. So we have like 7 different P&Ls, 1 to 10 different data sets or data owners per P&L. And so as a data scientist, or before we had a data lake concept, we want to do a project that maybe uses 5 or 6 of these different ones. We had to go individually negotiate access to those databases, where they were at, pull them all together, link them up. And that was obviously very challenging. So the data lake concept is like, all right, let's have everyone contribute into this single place so we can scale data science initiatives and run off this one location. But then the challenge is, okay, who maintains what goes in? Are the people who are contributing responsible for what's in there? And that's been, and that to Jeff's point about the self-service model, that's been the route that we've chosen to go. There's certainly, I think, drawbacks to that, right? It produces a lot of more overhead for the data producers. Now they have to maintain another copy of what they're doing. And for us, like, we're having, if the onus is on us as the consumer to be using the right data for the right use case, we still have to be going to them and asking, when is this, when should we use this value or this field or that field? So that's been the route that we've taken. I think that a couple of years ago, we actually, before Jeff joined the initiative, we tried to do an alternative approach where we had a data lake team that kind of took ownership of the data and pumped it all in themselves. And that ultimately fell apart because those engineers and that team didn't quite understand what they were working with. They weren't the owners. So this is actually round 2, and it's going much smoother. But I think that's an interesting like dynamic of the governance of the content that's in your pooled lake.
Jeff, how do you think about the security of all those different data sets? So if we're pulling them together from 7 different P&Ls, everyone has their own different contracts with data vendors. Some P&L owners don't want their data in Amazon. How do you manage all of that?
So we've taken kind of a decentralized approach to the lake. So if you read some of the Gartner articles on data lakes, they talk about this concept of zones, different zones in the lake. And so we have kind of a central lake, and then we have what you would call maybe ponds. And they are part of the overall logical data lake setup. But they're essentially buckets that are owned by specific groups. And so the central bucket is where we get all the kind of the non-PII type data into that pretty much everyone in the company can leverage. If there's sensitive fields, we have a scrubbing service where we can actually like one-way hash. Well, first we kind of normalize like a field, so like an email address. We make sure it has the dot, whatever, and the ampersand and stuff, and so we make sure that these or a phone number, we'll make sure the parentheses and the dashes are taken out. So a number in data set A, phone number in data set A is the same as a phone number in data set B, and then we do one-way hashing of those values, and that allows you to kind of join on those different data sets by that column if you want to do that. So we do support kind of one-way hashing, but and PII scrubbing in the main lake. But we've made a choice right now to not have sensitive data in the main lake. It can reside kind of outside in other people's S3 buckets in Amazon. And frankly, we're waiting for, Amazon's got Amazon Lake Formation, and they are tackling this problem around entitlements. And so we're waiting for them to kind of release some features. They released some data entitlements, column level data entitlements with the Lake Formation release they did like a month or two ago. But row level and attribute level entitlements is something that we're really waiting for. So we've chosen to punt, and frankly, it makes things easier for us because we're not like a lot of these products have SOC 2 compliance regulations, and so if we don't have sensitive data in the main lake, we can get out of some of these like audits essentially because we fall out of scope of that. So the overhead of that gets minimized.
Cool. So it sounds like we've covered a lot of ground about QA, maintenance, model deployment, and it sounds like you guys have a pretty good working relationship. But maybe if you could talk about the areas where you've failed and things have broken down in the past couple of years.
Yeah, so I think the first, like, what used to be a big challenge, but isn't really so anymore. I think the data science industry probably is what's driven this the most. Is I used to always get the question, hey, I'd be like, hey, I want some data for this project, and they say, okay, what sample do you want? It's like, well, no, I want all of it, please. And then they would come back, well, yeah, but which rows? And I was like, no, kind of all of it. And that used to go back and forth a lot. I haven't fought that battle in a long, long time. I think now it's more around, and I don't think it's really like arguments so much, but it's still like uncharted territory, I feel like, in a couple of areas. One is operating model. So how do you like manage the actual research process at scale? And so, we've decided to go with Agile and adopt that in some different ways that I mentioned before. And I can get more specific if there are questions. And I think the other way that's more collaboration between Jeff and I has been around QA and DevOps, which we've had a lot of really heated discussions on, but at this point I think we've settled on a decent model. Like one of the big differentiation features, at least in my mind, that's really broken the division of labor of who maintains what and how deep is how frequently the models run and how they are trained. So we have applications where users can come in and they can input their own features, their own model parameters, et cetera, and then we'll spin up a model on the fly and deliver back results and deliver back insights. And where performance requirements like that are really important, that's all going, we'll just provide prototype examples to Jeff's team. But where we can run things, we don't have as this kind of stringent SLAs, we can run things in batch that can go over the weekend, and we can take a day or two to do deep dive validation. We've taken more ownership of that. So that's been one natural breaking point.
And I mean, going back to QA, I think that there was a frustrating point early on where there's the model runs and the quants do QA on the model and say it looks good, and then the data gets fed into the product, and there's product level QA that are part of the IT organization, and they're looking at the product and the right data is not showing up. And so what they end up doing is they end up entering like 10 different tickets of symptoms of maybe there was a problem that was identified in the model run, that was root cause, but the QA is just churning with a bunch of noise because they're seeing all these different symptoms and they don't, and do they know it's part of that root cause, or is it actually something else? And so that there was a lot of churn and a lot of inefficiency with that. And that's where I think, once again, going back to kind of sharing, what we've done is we're sharing the Jupyter notebooks that the quants were using for their checks, and we're actually using Papermill to automate them and turn them into kind of like headless integration tests, essentially, or smoke tests. And so our QA team is responsible for kind of making sure that those Papermill that automation is happening.
Cool. Time for questions?
So in your experience with regards to model deployment, when you deploy a model, I just wanted to have like a 50,000 feet kind of an overview, how exactly you go about deploying the model, because obviously as data scientists, we are performing EDA and everything in Jupyter notebooks. I just wanted to understand from your experience how exactly most efficiently you deploy the model, how it executes, how do you feed data to it? Because we are working with PII scavenged data. So how is the production data fed to it? And the second part is, how do you then record for iterative feedback? How do you inculcate or implement that then? Second part.
I can probably answer the first question about model deployment. So I would say that our team in the last several years has moved away from Jupyter notebooks and into more developing packages. And then the packages, point to the data lake to then pick up data when they're run on an EC2 instance or an EMR cluster. And then the package is controlled by some configuration file where most things are parameterized. And so then that way we can run, 10, 15 different iterations of the model to then look at those results. Did I see anything?
And then I think for the iterative feedback, I guess it kind of depends what context you're coming out from that with that question. But most of the, so I think what's different about maybe the quant research team at Morningstar versus like other data science groups is we don't actually incorporating a lot of user feedback. I don't know if that's where you were going with that question. But like, for example, there's iterative feedback. You want the models to be learning as it goes from user interactions and so forth. We're generally not doing that because, oh, I see. So in that case, I mean, like if the accuracy was falling, it's like triggering some alarms and we need to go in and look at why. I mean, we would have somebody go in and examine the input features. Most of the time it's related to data in our cases. And so that would, potentially trigger some upscale warnings back to what's coming into the lake or of that nature. But usually we're not going in, like every month or every week, we're usually doing full retrains. So if like the relationship between the data and our objective is changed, we're picking that up. But if, for example, it warrants like there's no problem with the data, we've retrained and things are still kind of off and we need to maybe potentially look at an entirely new approach, that's like a longer, deeper dive investigation. We have an assumption built into our operating model that every model needs to be revisited in its entirety from the ground up every 5 years. Just that's how we like resource plan. So we anticipate for things we've rolled out a few years ago that we'll have to be like taking a hard look at them again. But hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I mean the data lake, right? We have a staging and production essentially instance, and the way you access the production data is the exact same way you would access it in staging. So, as you propagate through environments, you're literally just pointing to another S3 kind of URL, but the relative conventions of where the files are located and how they're stored is consistent. So it just follows kind of the standard like CI/CD, propagate through environments kind of process. There is the goal.
Earlier in the conversation, I believe you mentioned testing out new data sets. So I'm curious, aside from like, for me, top of mind, a data acquisition or something like that would acquire a new data set. Are you speaking of data sets in that sense? Because you mentioned that you could test the data set out. So what data sets are you referring to that you would get and then decide whether or not you wanted to keep?
Acquisition or licensing or trialing new data sets. So kind of those are three common ways. Or we have other producers of data, and at least in our company's context. And so if they're produce some new analytic or feature or what have you, we want to like pull that in and see, learn about the schema, learn about the purpose, et cetera, and see if it combines well with other things that we're trying to do.
Yeah, oftentimes Morningstar does acquire companies for their data, but then it's oftentimes joining them internally. So for example, last year we bought an ESG proxy vote company, and so we're taking that data and then mapping it back to some of our equity data, some of our fund data. And so we're like revisiting old data just in new ways because we can join it and answer new questions.
ESG is sustainability. I don't know if people
climate stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great overview of your infrastructure. Do you strive to have the standard process for all the models? And if a new model needs some additional support from IT, how do you prioritize this work?
It's a bit of a love-hate relationship. So, depending, I might bring Jeff cookies, or I might go to his boss and complain. It kind of depends. No, so like I think the way that we work with IT, I think certainly it depends on the maturity of the data science organization. I think now that we are realistically, now that we're more established, and now that we have relationships, and now that we have responsibilities, we kind of grown up, and so we work together, I think, in a much more kind of typical way that you would see departments working together. We're doing 2020 roadmap planning together, so we sit in the war room and we draw stuff out on diagrams, and we look at resource and stuff, and Madison submits her requirements for her models that she needs to work on. We just kind of hash all that out months in advance. Usually we do it about annually. Mid-year, sprint to sprint, it's kind of just, I don't know what the right word would be, but a little more guerrilla warfare, trying to figure it out. Certainly, yeah. So our data science team or quant research team at Morningstar is a centralized unit. So for the most part, I'm working with our funders or different P&Ls that have contributed capital into the group, and we're on a monthly basis, Jeff, myself, and others that represent the combined teams. We talk about what we're working on. So these are the priorities. You kind of stakeholder-y folks, you can disagree with them or not. It's more of a readout, and they can provide feedback if they want to change things. Thus far, it hasn't really. We haven't really had big disagreements about where the value seems to sit at the top 10 level. It's usually kind of projects 11 through 20 where there might be some different rankings.
Yeah, I mean, we have commercial heads of various kind of product suites. So an example for the risk model is, just earlier this week, we're looking at selling our risk model, and there was a conversation. Well, feedback we're getting from users is they want fixed income as part of the risk model. So now the question is how do we prioritize getting fixed income into the data lake, and then updating the model to leverage it essentially. And so that's part of kind of that road mapping exercise, that we respond to kind of that feedback in an agile manner and try and adjust our roadmaps. But it's definitely, it's, collaboration, right? At the end of the day, it's just,
yeah, nobody's giving you a big long list of these are the exact things you got to go do, execute. It's definitely incumbent upon us to discover that list, I guess, and come to a agreement.
So I have a question on, so it sounds like there's derived data products sitting on top of derived data products, sitting on top of derived data products. Yep. And I imagine they're all nonlinear kind of transformations and aggregations and things like that. So what happens when something on the bottom of that rung kind of changes? I would imagine you would have to refit or recalibrate models on top of that stack. And that seems like an operational challenge because you would have to backfill to get enough data to train the next thing. And so how often does that situation happen? And is it more reactive or proactive? And can you elaborate on that?
I actually, we're going through one of those right now. Madison's jumped the gun, wants to get in on it. But I think it's generally more reactive in my opinion. It actually doesn't happen as often as you might expect because we're trying to get the data usually at the rawest level possible because we want to control all of our own transformations because. And this is something actually also that Jeff and I have talked about, and I think we've kind of settled on this, but we view data transformations as part of the model building process, not as something separate. And so we were debating for a while, maybe we should do all our transformations one time and store those in the data lake for everyone to use. But we've kind of changed, we've changed view on that. It's okay, it's more model driven. Which model, how we want to transform things. And so we've usually tried to use as much raw data as possible, but sometimes even that changes.
Yeah, so Morningstar has a big data collections team. And so, for example, if a fund misreports its assets or returns or something, then that'll get funneled through into the raw data set. But what we've been able to do is not incrementally run our models, but refit them historically every time we run them. So if an analyst went back in 3 months ago, updated a return for 3 months ago, that would get fixed with each model run. And so if it's sort of like, one-off, rows, it ends up not being as big of a deal. But if like a whole exchange, there was some mess up with the ingestion process, then our QA practices would pick that up, because we wouldn't run the model if, all the prices were 10 times, 100 times what they were the day before. And so some of it's caught with our QA, and some of it's just fixed itself with every iterative run.
The more systematic stuff, like if they change reference data, that's a big one. So we had some of our classification data change in the last couple of weeks and had to kind of go through a process of what's the impact analysis of that. But yeah, individual values and attributes hasn't been as big of a deal because of that historical retraining. The team kind of views itself as an R&D engine, which I think most data science teams are, and I kind of view my role as leading the team to do R&D on how to figure out how to lead this R&D team. So we've done a lot of experiments. So we didn't arrive there. I didn't like in the shower just discover the perfect solution. And I don't think what we have today is perfect, but a lot of tweaking and evolving as we went. It started off with just listening to the team and the pain points we were having. So, hey, we were getting crushed with like KLO, our data scientists, quant researchers. They're like, man, I'm answering questions all day, or having to like fix these little bugs that are not a good use of time. And so, thinking about the ROI of the team's activities, and then, okay, so we should have that was kind of like, okay, maybe we should think about maintenance. And then we had an issue where one of our models wasn't performing in production as much as we wanted. We needed to go through a process of kind of reimagining it from the ground up. Okay, so there's got to be an end of life aspect to it, right? And then we had a data set that we acquired, so it's kind of like through experience, we kind of realized there's these different pieces, different types of activities that we're doing. And while in general, when you're in that research mode of trying to figure out what the right model is, you're kind of in a Markov chain of like working around from, build a model, test a new feature, run the model again, see the importance, build another new feature, clean some data. You're kind of like bouncing around a lot in that research phase. If you step even further back, there is kind of this like nice, like pretty linear development process that you can go through, going from having no idea to what you want to build to having deployed it. So it was just, it took, I think, several years of experimenting, learning about different situations that came up. So it wasn't ordained. The
other thing I think when we think about projects and their different life cycles, some of the requirements that we need to support our team changes. So if something goes into model development phase, then we're going to have a Scrum Master come in and manage a Jira board and manage tickets and make sure that we work with the external teams that we hit our product delivery roadmaps. And then similarly, when it's in more go-to-market, that's when we work with marketing and sales. And so being able to more clearly define where a project is, it helps us provide our teams with some of the other resources that they need. Because we don't want to like overburden some of our, analyst researchers with unnecessary ceremonies if it's not going to really add value.
And on the resources front, so when something has been launched, like the DevOps QA folks are kind of on the hook, and so they're like dedicated to that. But pretty much everything else before that, like the software engineering teams, the data science teams, data engineering teams, we're trying, at least my preference is to try to manage that in as generalized or as like a generalist way as possible, as opposed to specialists. I'd rather have a team of, like a data engineer and a data scientist and a software engineer working together on a problem than like in a linear kind of like one person hands to the next. And that's a big discussion point in like how to manage AI teams or data science teams effectively. I've definitely opted for the generalist route because I think it's more engaging for people that are early to mid-career to want to have like a variety of skills. Although that is very cultural, depending on where you're sitting. In the U.S., it tends to be very preferred, but in like India, for example, it's actually that people don't like that. They want to have their lane and stick to it. So it kind of depends, but in general, that's been how the first 4 stages were pretty generalized, and we're actually trying to get people with more engineering backgrounds as early in the process as possible.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, when we talk about kind of the development process and productionizing these models and taking it through these stages, I think from like an IT perspective, it goes back to kind of being on ends of the spectrum and trying both sides to kind of meet in the middle and learn from each other. And so, it started with how do we black box these models and just deploy them efficiently in a black box manner. And then through like as a part of like evolving and maturity, it's more of like, how do we can we get into the code and provide some guardrails or some conventions? That's kind of where we're at right now. How can we, this is part of our 2020 roadmap, is how can we actually evolve so that one, we have a convention-based approach of how the quants code, so that maybe we can decouple things or scale them more efficiently, things like that. And another thing we've been talking about doing is doing some training, like a book club on clean code, for instance, for the data scientists. Like, they don't necessarily come from a computer science background, and that's fine. They don't need to know like what an enterprise service bus is, or how you build scalable enterprise level architectures. Like, that's not their bread and butter, obviously. But there is this kind of low cost but huge reward of just like, from a programming, syntax, readability, small method, writing discrete functions, not duplicating, cut and pasting code, like all of this stuff. First 5 chapters of the book Clean Code, as an example, right? There is stuff that you can actually, I think, transfer, and it's very low hanging fruit, and it will help being able to support and refactor the models going forward. So there is, I do think there's a training opportunity there. It doesn't have to go crazy by any means, but you can get a lot for little, I think.
So thank you very much.
Yep.